Well, hello, good afternoon. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, the president of the Berggruen Institute and the host of a podcast called Futurology. And given the topic and theme of this conference, it seems like a great place to do a shameless plug for a podcast called Futurology. We study the future and we explore through interviews the ideas that are helping us navigate that future in a moment of great transformation. So please listen to the podcast. Today we're going to be talking about consciousness, and I'm on stage with two world-renowned neuroscientists, Dr. Anil Seth of the University of Sussex and Dr. Giulio Tononi of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Both of whom have theories of consciousness that I think illuminate a question that we've been asking for millennia. This question about what consciousness is, where it comes from, who has it and who does not, and why it exists, is one that we've been asking obviously for a very long time, but it's been reanimated recently because of the emergence of AI, obviously. And the emergence of LLMs that seemingly express themselves as we do and seemingly reason as we do. For the longest time and for centuries, our definition of being human was our ability to reason. I think, therefore I am. And yet, that may not be the distinctive feature that makes us human. And having to reinvent what it means to be human in light of AI consciousness creates a kind of urgency, a moral and ethical urgency to answer this question. So here to illuminate that, as I said, are two amazing neuroscientists, both with different theories of consciousness. I'm going to start by asking about integrated information theory, which is a theory of consciousness that was developed by Dr. Giulio Tononi with some collaborators, that basically, and I'm going to let him describe it, but I wanted to ask specifically about this description of it, Dr. Tononi, which is that it is a system's capacity, I guess, to integrate information, and it has something to do with cause-effect power. Could you walk us through what integration information theory is?
Sure. Thank you, Dawn, and glad to be here to talk about consciousness and the future. So let me just say, it's essential to define what we are talking about for all of us here. Consciousness is experience, is everything you see, hear, feel, any thought you have, any emotion you might feel. So essentially, it's everything you are and everything you have. When it goes away, like in dreamless sleep, nothing is left. That's quite important, I would say, in this context, that if you had genie and you were to have a wish, and the wish were everything you might possibly want, and that would come, however, with string attached, no consciousness, nothing would be worth anything, because consciousness is really all there is. So having said that, it's really the most important, the only thing, if you wish, for each of us, everyone's private universe. Then the question is, how do you characterize it scientifically, and how do you test that? And integrated information theory, which is really I have worked all my life on, is a way to describe the properties that are true of every experience, the essential properties of consciousness, and then ask, what does it take to have it? And in short, these properties are such that when you put them in mathematical and then physical terms, suggest that to have consciousness, to exist like you and me right now, to hear and see, you need a very special substrate, a very special one which is interconnected in a very, very special way so that it can support this great cause-effect power. I won't be able to explain that, but think of it as a giant building, a giant temple, in fact, immense one once you begin to measure it, that every moment of our life sort of exists, and that is what it is like to experience. And then we go and test whether this indeed is the substrate one needs, and go to the brain. We know that the brain is essential for consciousness. You touch the brain, you run the risk of destroying it. In fact, some parts are critical and some are not. That's one way to test the theory. I'll give you one example to keep it short. There is one part of the brain the cerebral cortex, especially back here, that is critical. If that is damaged, you are gone. You don't exist anymore. You're in a vegetative state. And other parts, like the cerebellum back here, which have 4/5 of the neurons of the brain, 80 billion neurons. You take that out, even though it's a fantastically complicated machine, and your consciousness is basically not affected at all. So there is a very clear prediction there. You need to have a very special substrate arranged in a certain way so that is maximally integrated, and that is what gives you this causal power. I'll leave it there because otherwise we won't have time.
Let me push on one thing. Yeah. So it's interesting that your theory is described as substrate independent, and yet you spend an awful lot of time in the theory talking about the properties of that substrate. How do you explain that contradiction?
It is substrate independent theoretically, in the sense that, in principle, if you have a system that can support integrated information, the mathematical formula is called phi, then it can be conscious to different extents and in different ways. But it turns out that to be able to be the right kind of substrate, to maximize this quantity, you need a substrate that's very special. And the only place where we can see something like that in the known universe, as far as we can tell, is precisely in here. Mm-hmm. And not just in the brain, only some parts of the brain, which makes it a very, very special thing and a very, very precious thing.
So, Dr. Anil Seth, as opposed to this theory that Dr. Tononi just explained to us, it seems like your theory, the neurobiological beast machine, is actually very substrate specific. Could you explain a little bit about your theory of consciousness?
Yes, thank you, Dawn, and thank you, Giulio. I actually hesitate to use the word theory because I think the ideas that I'm comfortable with working with and with developing don't constitute, if you like, here's a set of sufficient conditions that make something conscious, like Giulio's theory does. But it's a way of thinking about how brains do what they do that has a very long history that I think gives you resources to understand the richness, the diversity, the variety of conscious experiences that we have. So the basic idea is that to think of the brain as a prediction machine. It's easy to think that you open your eyes and the world just pours itself into your mind through the transparent windows of your eyes and through your ears as well. And it's just there, and we kind of soak it up, and the self is inside the skull somewhere, the recipient of all these perceptions, deciding what to do next. The idea of the brain as a prediction machine turns this on its head, and it suggests that, from the brain's perspective, there's no, it doesn't receive sound or light directly. All it gets are electrical impulses coming through the senses. It has to make sense of these. So the core idea is the brain is always making predictions, or best guesses, if you like, about what's most likely to be out there in the world or in the body to explain the sensory data that it gets. And the proposal is there's this core process of the brain continually calibrating, updating its predictions to explain away the sensory data. What we hear, what we see, what we feel in this framework are coming more from the inside out than from the outside in. They're controlled hallucinations, if you like. If you pull on this thread long enough, and again, I don't want to take too much time, but the idea is if you start thinking about how the brain constructs, let's say, the visual world this way, colors and shapes and faces and people, and then you apply the same way of thinking of the brain making and updating predictions to the body, you start to understand that the nature of the self, that the self is also a bundle of brain-based predictions. And then the connection to this term of substrate dependency, which you mentioned, which basically means it's really dependent on the stuff that it's made of, that you can't really separate what something is from what it does. So in my way of thinking, this notion of the brain as a prediction machine goes right down to a fundamental imperative for the brain to keep the body alive. It doesn't sort of bottom out in any way where you think, okay, the rest of our biology doesn't matter. Even single cells are busy actively maintaining their conditions for existence, and in my view, doing this with the same process that underpins our visual experience. So the way I think of it, it's kind of life rather than some abstract computation that breeds the fire into the equations of consciousness.
So it's really interesting that your theory of consciousness depends on what I would consider a very subconscious process, right? The idea that like our brains keep us alive. It keeps our heart running, keeps our temperature steady, our blood pressure. But those are things we're not conscious of. That's kind of happening in the background. So I guess, how do you write that kind of contradiction?
Well, I mean, as Giulio mentioned, it's no surprise that a lot of what brains and bodies do, it doesn't surface into our consciousness. A lot of it goes along under the hood.
Yeah.
But even what the mechanisms that do underpin our conscious experience, for me, there's no contradiction that they're built on the same processes that might be involved in basic challenges that bodies and brains face all the time. And we are aware of some of these things, but we're just aware of them in different ways. So when we're aware of like looking around, I'm aware of the chair over there and people because they appear to me as distinct objects in my phenomenology, in my experience. When I'm aware of something like the physiological condition of my body, of course I don't perceive my heart, blood pressure directly, but I experience emotion, I experience mood, I experience things going well or badly for my prospects of staying alive. So I think we do experience a lot of these basic physiological processes, but we do so through the lens of how well we're doing at persisting as living creatures.
So I'd love for you both to comment on how your theories complement or contradict each other. So I'll go to you first, Giulio.
Okay. Well, I think that the most obvious difference...
And try not to upset him.
No.
Oh, we already did that yesterday.
That will not happen, The most peculiar thing about IIT is that it's really the theory that is consciousness first. It starts from consciousness. It doesn't ask how does the brain produce it. It asks what is it, and then what does it take to support it. The other thing I would say is that IIT really says consciousness experience is about being, and it's not about doing. Doing only secondarily. But the most important thing is that when you're conscious, you exist, you are. And yes, when you are, you can also do things. Another consequence of IIT, which I think will lead to the next question, is if IIT is right, which is something that we have tried to validate in our brain by seeing indeed which parts matter for consciousness as predicted by the theory, why does it go away when you're in deep sleep or in anesthesia, can you build machines, which we have, to test whether patients who are unresponsive are conscious or not? Can we explain why it feels the way it does, why space feels extended, why time feels flowing? So all these things we can test on ourselves. That's the only place where you can test it scientifically. And if so, it follows that, for instance, machines, intelligent as they might be, so AI, absolutely are not conscious because they have the wrong wiring. So these are peculiarities of IIT. They are not all different from what Anil would say, I think, but they are important to keep in mind.
Okay.
The theories are really rather different, and I think this is largely because IIT is actually quite different from almost any other theory that proposes a relationship between the brain and conscious experience. And Giulio has sort of explained that in the sense that most theories look at not necessarily what a person does, the intelligent behavior or cognitive operations that a person does, but it's fundamentally looking at neural activity or neural dynamics of some sort. And IIT does not look in those places. It looks for something more fundamental to what a system is, its structure, its cause effects, power. This actually is a big challenge in terms of how you might experimentally distinguish between theories. One of the developments in consciousness research over the last few years has been an initiative to get proponents of different theories to come together to try to design experiments that actually have the potential to distinguish between these theories. And it's a really interesting challenge when they start from different places and when they're actually theories of different aspects of the same thing. There are ways to contrast them, but fundamentally, the theory of the brain as a prediction machine does associate consciousness with a particular kind of neural dynamics, neural activity of the sort involved in the brain inferring things about the world. So the fundamental claim there is what determines the content of our experience is the sort of the flip side, the experiential flip side of the brain inferring something. And that's a very different process to the process that IIT suggests. There are some commonalities. The one commonality, again, it relates to the question we'll come to, is that in my way of seeing things, it's not about computation. Consciousness is not the kind of thing that you can abstract away from the brain and run in an algorithm on a rack of GPUs somewhere. It's something that's fundamentally tied to aspects of what we are. Now, our ideas tie it to different aspects, but I think both of us would agree that consciousness is not something that can live in the world of input-output algorithm.
On that, we completely agree.
Actually, my next question was, is there, let me, how I wrote it, is there room in either of your theories for AI consciousness? Is it I don't think it's possible, or it would never be possible, given the theories?
So for IIT, you can actually prove that standard computers, the ones that are used now and probably in the foreseeable future, are not going to be conscious in any meaningful way. So that can be ruled out if IIT is correct. It doesn't rule out 100% that some neuromorphic computers that become closer and closer, and we still don't know how close, to parts of our brain may actually do it. But that's certainly not something which is happening anytime soon. And that certainly has nothing to do with intelligence. That is the important thing. So what we are faced with now is the onslaught of artificial intelligence that basically does everything we do and is going to do it better than we do. It can talk, it can speak any language, it knows everything, it has read all the books, and it can obviously put us in a situation of existential crisis, of a crisis of meaninglessness, because after all, if we define ourselves by our intelligence, which we tend to do, then these machines are going to clearly surpass us. That's going to happen. You can decide when, are you already there, is it happening or not? But what IIT says is there is nobody there. These are just tools, these are just objects as smart as they are. So one of the most important consequences for IIT is that we should treat these machines, all the ones we see now, no matter how powerful, purely as tools, as objects, not as subjects, that we should especially be careful in evaluating and evaluating our consciousness. That's the most important thing there is. Intelligence has been, in my mind, overrated, vastly overrated. Consciousness is the most important thing. And finally, that what we should do is cultivate our consciousness through learning and through community, society, which is where consciousness gets enriched. I think those are key consequences. There are other of an ethical kind that I'm sure you want to comment on.
Yeah.
They are all urgent, as you say.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of points of agreement with Giulio here. There is, I think, a need for a little bit of I would say, epistemic restraint. We don't know. Like, we have our theories, then none of them are consensus theories yet. We don't know for sure. No, we don't know for sure what the sufficient conditions are or the necessary conditions are for consciousness. Within each theory, we can say what that theory would say. So I think it's very, very unlikely that AI could be conscious, at least for the kinds of AI systems that we are familiar with, but I couldn't rule it out altogether. From my perspective, the reason we tend to think that AI is on a path to consciousness is partly because of our psychological biases, that we see the world through the lens of being human and we associate consciousness with intelligence. So where we see something that looks like it's intelligent, especially when it uses language, then we project into it all sorts of other qualities that go along with intelligence in us, but which need not go together in general. It's always struck me that there's a lot of debate about whether language models might actually have experiences, but basically nobody thinks that DeepMind's AlphaFold is conscious, even though under the hood it's pretty much the same thing. It just doesn't pull on our psychological strings in the same way. Now, at a deeper level, I think we've become overly seduced by the metaphor that the brain is a computer. This has been a very, very powerful metaphor. It's allowed us to understand this implacable complexity of the gray goo inside our skulls. We can reduce it to abstract networks of neurons, and that's a powerful thing to do. It underpins all the AI that we have. But metaphors are just metaphors, and we always get ourselves into trouble when we confuse the map with the territory, the metaphor with the thing itself. But I do think that as AI changes, and here's another agreement with Giulio, that as AI becomes progressively more brain-like, then the situation changes. It's not going to, just making language models smarter isn't going to move the needle, in my point of view. But as the underlying mechanisms become increasingly similar to the only case we know that consciousness happens, which is the brain, the biological brain, then that may move the needle. The question is, how brain-like does AI have to be to change, to move the needle in this way? And here, the different theories would make different predictions.
Different assumptions.
Yeah.
Because it strikes me that not only, well, if it's substrate independent, right, according to IIT, and that whatever it's doing actually fits the substrate, fits the properties of that, wouldn't it then potentially be conscious? I'm not talking about what it's capable of today, but under that definition, if it did meet those properties, would IIT say yes, it is conscious?
Yes, but we have strong reasons to suspect that to satisfy those properties, you will end up being very, very close to certain parts of our brain. The most important thing, though, is to remember that it is what it is, the substrate, as opposed to what it does, its causal powers. So as Anil was saying, we project consciousness evolutionarily onto intelligence. When we see intelligent behavior, we say, well, that's conscious because that's how it works with us. But it doesn't work all the time. We know this very well, for instance, for patients with certain brain lesions. We have now all the reasons to infer that they have a rich experience inside them. They just cannot communicate at all.
Right.
So that is, and they are cognitively impaired. So that's an example of consciousness without intelligence, essentially. But you are there, the person is there, and we want to absolutely reassure everybody that that is the case. That's why we developed these tools to evaluate that. On the other hand, we have now machines that are fantastically articulate, seductive, able to conduct a conversation much smarter than the one we are entertaining now. And those machines, if we are right, absolutely have nobody home. And so that contrast between the inarticulate patient, or even baby for that matter, and the incredibly articulate AI, I think is one we should bear in mind when I say again that we should reevaluate the importance of experience of consciousness and perhaps consider intelligence not as the apex of what we can do, but just as a tool, like what we use machines for.
So we're about out of time, but I'm going to try to ask this question quickly to Seth. By the same token that I just asked him a question, if AI, which is now, behaving in ways that for self-preservation, and is, increasingly deceptive, and is showing awareness of itself, self-awareness, does any of that lead you to a conclusion that maybe there's consciousness there?
No, I don't. I think we cannot infer consciousness reliably from the overt behavior of AI systems, because there are other ways in which that behavior can be generated. And that's really the danger here. I mean, I just want to make 3 quick points to close, I think, from my perspective. One is that, hopefully this is obvious, but the idea of creating conscious AI, whether or not it's possible, is a terrible idea. We should not be trying to do it. It's an ethical catastrophe to introduce into the world potential new forms of suffering that we might not even recognize. I think it's a good thing that it's very unlikely. The second point, very quickly, is that where we are now, we often confuse the question of whether AI is really conscious with the clear and present risks of AI that seems to be conscious. That's here and now. People already think that it is. Some people think that, at least. That carries with it all kinds of social problems and challenges. We are more psychologically vulnerable. We might brutalize our own minds if we treat AI systems that seem conscious badly. If we're nasty to ChatGPT, it's bad for us, psychologically unhealthy for us. And then so we should not build those systems even to appear to be conscious. And I think that's the third point, that there sometimes seems to be this sense of inevitability about the direction, the trajectory of AI, that it's going to sort of approach the human case and then blast right through it, and we'll be in the world of ASI or some futuristic Terminator or utopia. It's either triumph or disaster, right, isn't it? It's a utopia or it's apocalypse. And I think, this is nice to be here in Dubai, thinking about different manifestations of possible futures. The future history of AI is not yet written. And to assume that there's this single trajectory that goes through the human point in the space of possible minds and then continues onwards, I think is an unfortunate lack of imagination. And we can imagine all kinds of futures for AI where, as Giulio said, they don't replace us or pretend to be us. They complement us, they extend us, they augment us. We can build AI tools that are violins rather than forks, that allow us to express our humanity and our human consciousness more effectively in a way that contributes to human flourishing rather than diminishing us. And we see ourselves, when we see ourselves as nothing more than algorithms, then I think we do ourselves a disservice and we overestimate the systems that we build.